Hello, I'm Jim Coyle, and this is the last tutorial for social work with individuals. And I'm going to be talking today about crisis intervention. Crisis theory kind of addresses a reaction to an unusual event in which person's normal coping is insufficient to deal with this event. Since the individual's response to this event is this crisis or this stress is unique, it is the individual that is the expert about their own recovery. And whenever possible, you want a natural recovery process that should occur because that tends to work better. It's related to stress and coping theory, which is a theoretical perspective in which stresses may be anything positive or negative that impact a person. They may be biological, psychological, social, or environmental. The perception of stress influences a person's response. So if something happens and we perceive it as being part of our ordinary life, our tendency is to kind of use the coping mechanisms that we already tend to use, and that generally is okay. Now, on the other hand, if our perception is that this is very unusual and very overwhelming, that may result in us kind of shutting down, avoiding, or believing that we can't handle it, which tends to increase our fears and anxiety. Part of the coping mechanism for stress, a very important aspect of it, is the importance of social support. Having people around that are going to be supportive for you tends to be one of the better things to help individuals who are trying to cope with a particular crisis. There's also an element, there can also be an element of traumatic stress happening in which basic fears are triggered and a person's basic vulnerability is something that is occurring. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later on. The first thing I want you to do is consider, what do you know about crisis and about people's response to crisis? And what do you know about providing crisis intervention? You may know something from your past learning, from your observations with people, from the work that you've done in the past, or from your current reading. Ask to kind of review all of that in your mind and ask yourself what makes sense to you and what's uncertain. And jot down some ideas and your questions, because we're going to talk about this in class and it'll help you bring that up into our discussion. There's a number of different types of crises that social workers will deal with. Certainly, there's a very basic need for food, clothing, and shelter. And an appropriate social work response to that is to assess immediacy. How, is this an emergency or is this not? And refer for needed resources. It's also important to assess the overall coping response. Is a person generally able to cope with these types of stress as well, or is this kind of an emergency which is overwhelming them? It's also helpful to plan a follow-up to assure the needs are met. This is particularly true if you're going to refer a client for help from somebody else. It is a really important aspect to follow up with the client later to make sure that the referral happened and that it was effective, so that we don't leave the client out there and stranded if the referral did not work. Another type of crisis is related to kind of things that happen in the course of development. There may be a death in our lives, or an illness, or a transition from one developmental stage to the other. So a young person who is kind of leaving home and out on their own, for the first time, or parents who have, children that have left and are going through empty nest, or someone who's retiring and their whole life begins to change because it's no longer organized by work. These can lead to crises for people, but they're part of a developmental kind of transition, which for many people has a sense of, well, this is normal, but for other people, it has a sense of, I didn't expect this and I don't know what to deal with it. So once again, you assess the coping response. The coping response may be that they're taking an active interest in doing something different or changing things, and that's good. Or it could be avoidance. It could be denial. And the thing is part of what you want to do is assess how well is that kind of meeting their needs, as well as are there concrete needs that need to be taken care of. Young person who's out on their own and perhaps needs to, is not having enough money to feed and clothe themselves, and doesn't want to talk to parents because they'll feel like they're a failure. That puts them in a real bind, and we may need to kind of help them make a decision about what's going to best meet those concrete needs. It's also a matter of planning needed treatment, and treatment may involve any number of the different models that we've talked about in this course. Sometimes a crisis is related to a physical assault or an accident or a natural disaster. These days, we're hearing a lot about instances where people's crises are related to war, including the current war in Ukraine, but also the wars in the Middle East that refugees are being, coming to other places, but still having a lot of reactions to those particular wartime situations where many terrible things are witnessed. Certainly, crisis can be a response to past trauma. And trauma is, could be sexual abuse or physical abuse or some type of really kind of a traumatic situation that happened when someone was young. And in order to deal with that, it was kind of covered up. And sometimes you have adults who are, for some reason, something has happened which has made it more difficult for them to continue to cover this up. A trauma reaction generally has to do with something that is overwhelming for the person. It is somehow either experiencing or witnessing an event which is immensely invasive or life-threatening, and it kind of leads us to freeze because we don't know what to do in that type of situation. And sometimes when a person is experiencing these types of situations, there needs to be a connection between the trauma and what they're experiencing in order for them to move on. Crisis intervention generally includes a number of specific features that are similar to some of the models that we have, but they have perhaps a different relevance. We want to assess the level of crisis. Is a person experiencing somatic distress? That's physical complaints. Is it a transitional stress? Is there a trauma trauma reaction? That is are they having flashbacks? Are they having dissociation? Are they kind of experiencing high levels of anxiety that seem to come out of the blue, and they're not sure where that's coming from? Is there family or social distress or serious mental illness? Is there an emergency, such as a drug overdose or suicide attempt, in which case, our focus is on getting the person into a hospital situation so they can be assessed for physical needs and for safety, rather than trying to find out a lot more about the situation. Because this emergency may require sooner rather than later attention. You also want to assess the stages of crisis. Is the person who's reporting this crying for help? Are they overwhelmed? Are they in a denial situation? Or they could be even working through some of the trauma and already starting to do some things and working towards recovery, but they may need some reassurance that this is the best thing to do, or there's some other things that can help them accomplish this. They may also see the crisis as being resolved, and sometimes that's true, but there are some things that they can use to continue that resolution and make sure that the crisis doesn't affect them in the future, at least to the degree that it overwhelms them again. I'm suggesting that you use the ACT model, which is an acronym for assess, connect with social support, and look at traumatic stress reactions. This is one way that you can kind of focus on what is happening in the moment but you can see, is there something, if the stress is something that is workable and the person has coping mechanisms, but they're just overwhelmed at the moment, then we may be able to use other models to help them accomplish where they need to go. On the other hand, if they're overwhelmed and are not able to do things, they need a lot of outside resources and a lot of support in order to accomplish dealing with the stress. In the clinical case management or the crisis intervention, you are engaging and assessing. So these are the normal things that we would do no matter what model we're using. But we're also looking at what are the resources that a person has in their environment. We may need to advocate for them in terms of identifying something that would help them deal with, cope with whatever the situation is. We may need to help the client focus on skill development because their normal coping mechanisms are no longer effective and they need something a little bit more, as well as monitor progress. The thing is this is an ongoing issue, and so we may need to see, is the person progressing? Do they have the skills and the resources to get through the situation? Crisis intervention is about looking at and prioritizing what you're going to do. When you identify particular aspects that need some counseling treatment, you're going to use a lot of the same methods that we've talked about in the past. So ego psychology may fit very well. Some of the behavioral and cognitive theories fit very well, including CBT. Solution focus and narrative therapies can also fit well. One thing to keep in mind is that sometimes because of the situation that you're going to be providing crisis services. If you're asked to help somebody because there's been a natural disaster and you're helping people that are dealing with the disaster, or you're asking to help a group of people that have been involved in some type of assault or hostage situation or shooting or something like that, yes, you're going to use a crisis intervention perspective. Another example these days is if you're dealing with refugees that are coming from a wartime situation. On the other hand, if you are kind of working with people who are coming in and they're reporting, and the type of problem that they're reporting suggests that there could be a crisis. So if they're reporting that they don't have enough to eat or appropriate shelter, if they're reporting something that happened to them that may be involved in them having a traumatic reaction or a crisis reaction, such as an assault or a violent situation or a sexual abusive situation. The other thing is that their reaction to it, as you look at their symptom pattern, as you look at the way they present, if they are showing a high level of fear and anxiety, avoidance, or defensiveness, that may be indicative that this is a crisis situation. And so what you're doing is you're prioritizing, what do I need to work on first in order to maintain safety, in order to help the client take a look at what's happening and feel some hope for the future. And that's why this situation of the crisis intervention can be very helpful as a way of beginning and then deciding what kind of other models you might use. Certainly, one of the things that we have to be very careful about is when people are in crisis, sometimes they feel overwhelmed. And if they feel overwhelmed, lethality may be an issue. And although we certainly think about suicide when we think of a lethality assessment, you also need to take into consideration that this could include hurting other people. So the first thing you need to ask, and not be afraid to ask, because you're not going to be putting ideas into people's heads, is, have you thought about hurting yourself or hurting someone else? This is a very standard question. And, kind of a follow-up for that is have you thought about suicide in the past? Have you thought about hurting someone else in the past? See if has it been a coping mechanism for them in the past? So you need to be aware that this is something you should pay attention to. If they answer no at this point, then it isn't necessarily the case that you have to ask these other questions. You do need to assess, do they seem to be evasive or do they seem to be truthful and open? If they're evasive, you may want to ask a little bit more, ask for some more details or something like that. It's something you need to assess. And when I was working in a situation where I was talking to people on the phone because they called in crisis and we were responding to that. There are a lot of things that we needed to do to connect with the person, even though we may not know them, and ask about their situation in order to see, is there a real danger there? You ask about plan. Next, if they have some thoughts about it, how would you do that? How would you hurt yourself? Because that's the next step. So if they think about kind of having suicide, but they really haven't thought about a particular plan, then that's less lethal. It's still something to pay attention to. And by the way, I always believe when people tell me that they're suicidal, I always take that seriously. I do not take into consideration, oh, they may be manipulating me. It's not a matter of manipulation. It's too great a risk to believe that, well, maybe somebody's just looking for attention. You take them seriously. And I tell clients this. I always will take you seriously, because what I can do is I can arrange for an involuntary hospitalization if they are scary enough. And I don't think that I think that there's a chance that they are going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. The next step is means. How would you carry out your plan? If they have a plan, how would you carry out? Do they have the accessibility? So if they say they're going to shoot themselves, do they have access to a gun? They say they're going to take an overdose of pills. Do they have those pills available? Same thing with, rope to hang yourself or running out in traffic. Where would they do that? And is that a problem? Jumping off a bridge, where would you happen to do that? There are many types of situations, and the more accessible it is, the more dangerous it is. Finally, what you're doing is you're assessing imminence. When would you carry this out? If a person has a plan for doing this within the next 24 hours or something, then they're immensely dangerous. You don't want to put that, you want to basically make sure that somebody's going to be paying attention to this, and they may need hospitalization. You first try and get them to agree to it and go to the hospital. But there are methods where, police can be involved, or sometimes there's crisis teams that can go out and assess a situation to hospitalize people if they need to, because our goal is to prevent this from happening. Keep in mind that when you are in a situation and someone is in crisis or someone is immensely depressed, it is your ethical responsibility as a social worker to do a lethality assessment. And then in your documentation of that contact, you need to say that you did the lethality. So you need to say what you asked and what their response was. It is malpractice if someone manages to suicide after seeing you and you have not documented that you have done a lethality assessment when it seemed to be indicated. On the other hand, if you've documented that they said that they were not going to kill themselves, then that basically covers yourself professionally. Even if you made a mistake, at least you attempted to be there. And one of the issues with dealing with suicidal people is sometimes there's nothing, you have to take into consideration what they tell you. And sometimes they are going to be sly enough to withhold information because they've already made up their mind. It can be a very difficult situation, but it is very important that you do this assessment and document it. Spirituality is often very, very helpful when you are working with people in crisis. Talking about the person's spiritual beliefs and helping them see themselves in terms of more spiritual, a place in the world, that people do care about them, that there is a higher being that, that's there for them. That can be a very hopeful thing for them. And so it's a helpful thing to do. Sometimes linking them with church or clergy or pastoral counseling can also be a helpful kind of intervention because it fits with what they need. Other times, things like mindfulness training, meditation, journaling, or rituals can be very helpful. And that's a more spiritual aspect to the treatment that we do. Now, the case example that I'm going to suggest that you watch on YouTube is more specific rather than general. And I thought it was very helpful, even though it doesn't kind of go over a whole crisis intervention. or a whole assessment or things like that. It explains the freeze response to a client. And I thought that that was a helpful thing to see how you would explain pretty normal physical response to a client who's in a traumatic or crisis situation. So when you watch this video, see, kind of pay attention. What kind of methods is the worker using? What aspects of the treatment model fit with what you've learned? How does the worker address the crisis? How does the worker support the client? In general, as I've mentioned to you in the past, how does the worker engage the client, collect appropriate information, share an assessment with the client, and then plan something for the client to do? It can also be helpful to look at the example empty nest in the textbook as another way of kind of seeing how do you use crisis intervention with a client. Another thing to keep in mind is your personal reactions can really influence how you deal with a person's crisis situation. When a person is in crisis, and particularly when they have a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed, it is not unusual for us to begin having some of those feelings ourselves. That's not an unusual thing for us to happen when we are working with clients. But if a person's crisis is triggering our own crisis response because we had something similar happen to us, or we had a different crisis, but where it's triggering something like that, we have to be able to recognize that we're dealing with our own crisis here, and we have to be able to be using our own self-calming and our own cognitive ability to deal with that, because otherwise you may be trying to shut down what is happening in the counseling session because of your own level of discomfort, as opposed to helping the client. If you have a particular crisis that you are easily triggered on, it is very helpful for you to kind of take a look at how do I manage that on an ongoing basis in my own life. And that may kind of lead you to decide to get your own counseling to do this so that you're not triggered when clients come and share this information with you. It's also important to recognize that how we respond to crisis and our way of kind of interpreting the meaning of crisis is impacted by a lot of different things: gender, culture, age, ethnicity, religious beliefs, oppression, all kinds of those things. And so those need to be taken into consideration. And whenever you're working with a client in crisis, you may share some possibilities, but don't assume that their definition of crisis and their idea about how to best handle crisis is going to be the same as yours. It may be different, and you need to leave some opening for sharing. Well, do you think that this may fit? What may fit better for you? And to encourage them to share that information with you so that you can learn how they handle crisis in their particular situation, what makes the most sense to them. There's some benefits to using crisis intervention. It acknowledges the tremendous impact the crisis can have on people. It suggests a framework for managing those reactions, because those reactions are also overwhelming, but it's hopeful when you say, well, it is possible to handle this for the client as well as for the worker. And many people kind of talk about, they perceive crisis as an opportunity. In other words, kind of that old, kind of adage about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's an element of that, although I'm not sure that that's what I would start with if I'm working with people who are really feeling overwhelmed, because that's not a particularly helpful response. Although sometimes clients will say things like that, and then you can talk with them about how that fits and how they can kind of use that response to see hope in the future. Some people have critiqued crisis intervention methods because definitions of crisis vary. And also sometimes crisis intervention suggests that everybody goes through the same stages or crisis reactions, when there's quite a lot of variation and people have unique responses, and we need to take that into consideration. Some people will criticize crisis intervention as focusing on the immediate response without considering long-term change, or considering that sometimes those crisis reactions will influence different things down the line, and we really need to be paying attention to that. And I think that some methods of crisis intervention do pay attention to that, and it is an important factor to assess. As I've always ended this, when you hear a lot of this information, some of it's new, some of it may be things you already know. Put it together with what you know, what you've read, what your experiences are, and then ask yourself, what have you learned from all of these sources? What do you still need to learn? How can you get the answers that you need? How can you ask questions about this so that you can be more aware of how crisis intervention can help you in your social work practice? This is something that we'll talk about in class, and I look forward to speaking with you about it then.